This weekend on Q&A, our guest is 25-year-old Erica Williams. She's Deputy Director of Campus Progress, an arm of the Center for American Progress.
Erica Williams, can you tell me why you think Tavis Smiley invited you to be a part of his State of the Black Union last weekend?
Well, I can tell you why I hope he invited me. I actually met him not face-to-face, but via a phone and radio interview done several months ago about college affordability and the lack of access for communities of color, in particular young people of color. It was maybe about a 5-minute interview. At the end, he said, "You know, you're real sharp." And I said, "Well, thank you very much." The next thing I know, I had an invitation. So I'm hoping it's because, number one, whether it would be me or anyone else, that he wanted to have a representation of someone who is young, who is a part of what we're now calling the millennial generation, to perhaps give a different perspective. And I think I was just a lucky person he chose.
What were you doing at the time when you talked to him?
At the time when I spoke with him, I was working the same place I work now. I was the Director of Policy at the Center for American Progress, the Campus Progress Outreach Division of the Center. Working daily with young people to make sure that their voice is heard on the issues that matter, and in particular to me, making sure that we can pass progressive policy and help young people understand their part in that process.
The center does what?
So the center is basically a big think tank. They come up with innovative ideas and policy proposals to again, advance progressive policy issues. So they do a lot of research, working with Congress to be able to give suggestions and recommendations to kind of form the country that we as progressive Americans think we should have.
But right now, the head of that was the president's transition leader,
John Podesta. Yes, he was, but he's back home.
Are you surprised he didn't go into the administration?
Grateful. Grateful that he didn't. No, I mean, there was a lot of speculation about whether or not he would, but he assured us from the very beginning that he would return, and he kept his word.
Define the word progressive for you, from your perspective.
It's funny because I'll give you from my perspective, there is no kind of clear-cut definition. For me, progressive is a category that talks about this nation being everything that we hope it will be, and in that, being diverse, being inclusive, being a place of possibility where everyone has equal opportunity. Perhaps not equal outcome, but definitely equal opportunity. That, for me, is the most important tenet of progressivism. Now, before I'm going to run a clip of you on the stage in Los Angeles that Tavis Smiley presents. Were you nervous? Maybe for about 30 seconds before, but by the time he got to me, if you remembered, it was about an hour in because of the format of the panel where he gave everyone a good chance to speak. So by the time it got to me, I was so engaged with watching everyone else that I forgot I was on stage. So when he came to me, I was pretty relaxed by then. When you gave your 2 cents that day, who did you think about being out in the audience? Is there anybody you knew that was going to be watching? No, I mean, I was hoping that there were a lot of young people. We didn't get a chance to interact with the audience beforehand at all, and they kind of shipped us right over there from the hotel. So I didn't really know the makeup or the demographic of the audience that was there in person. I was hoping that there would be young people there because, again, we were so underrepresented on the actual panel. Okay, let's just look at a little bit of your presentation. Okay.
And there's been a rhetoric since the campaign that young people now, you got out and you voted. And first of all, that's an assumption that all young people voted. Yes, nearly 25 million young people did vote. That's a 55% increase over 2004. But if you actually analyze who those young people are, those are predominantly young people who had formal education. So there's still an aspect of our community as young people, and in particular young people of color, that has yet to be engaged. So number one, that work isn't done. But number two, after we're talking about, okay, so here we are, we're engaged, the rhetoric post-election has been, well, now it's all about service. Now go out and build a house. Now go out and wash one another's feet. I think that's wonderful. But for young people of color, that's the legacy of our community. We've been doing that for generations, right? Right? Pardon me if I don't wash your feet, but try to actually go figure out how you can buy some shoes and get you medical care so I can fix your toe. Okay, we're going to take this metaphor there. Service is the rhetoric that people are giving young people and pigeonholing us into that being the role. No, my service is taking my brown face to my senator's office with a list of demands and having 1 million young people behind me.
What would be first on your list of demands?
Ooh, what would be first? I think green jobs is something that I'm really passionate and interested about. Someone else on the panel, Van Jones, who's the executive director of Green for All, also spoke a little bit about this. But the idea that the challenge of our generation, or one of the greatest challenges, is climate change, saving our environment and saving our communities. the reason I'm so inspired by this idea of a green economy and green jobs is that it tackles two major issues that are of importance, particularly to people of color, which is, environment, environmental justice, but also jobs, poverty, the economy. And I think this is such an interesting solution and way to attack both problems. So that would be number one, increased funding for me, for green jobs.
Number two?
Number two, I think more federal funding for higher education. It's becoming more and more difficult for young people of all economic backgrounds, but in particular low-income young people to have access to higher education, which as for most people in this country is kind of the entry point to advancing people's status in life, advancing people's economic status and their future. And for our generation, that's something that's really huge and again becoming increasingly out of reach for us.
Last week we had Matthew Continetti on this network. He's 27 years old. He went to high school out here in Springfield, Virginia. He went to Columbia University.
Okay.
Ask you the same questions, if you don't mind. How
Sure.
old are you?
25.
Where'd you go to school?
Archbishop Spalding High School in Severn, Maryland.
So it's in the suburbs.
In the suburbs. Mm-hmm.
Where'd you go to college?
University of Maryland, College Park.
How did you get there? I mean, what were your interests in high school? What are your parents, what do they do?
Well, I'm the daughter of two full-time ministers, which I think the clip you just ran to me was really interesting, where I was saying that service isn't the only way, which is ironic because I grew up in a family of civil servants, people who devoted their life to their community through faith and religion. So I grew up in that environment, and when I went to undergrad, I actually started off at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I wanted to be a journalist. I loved writing, I loved communicating. I wasn't sure if I wanted to be print or broadcast, but I knew I wanted to talk and communicate. But as I began to do that, I realized that the issues that I loved writing about and the issues that I loved talking about actually really revolved around social justice, civil rights, and in particular people of color, and even more narrowly African Americans. At that time, my interest was kind of focused there. So when I ended up transferring, because I had scholarship money waiting from University of Maryland, which is why college affordability is so important to me now. When I ended up transferring, I switched majors, and I focused on African American studies and public policy there. From that point, I didn't really know what kind of job you got with that. I had a wonderful professor by the name of Clyde Woods, who when I graduated said, let me know what you want to do. And I said, well, I don't know if corporate America is for me. I have this degree, maybe something in a nonprofit. So he forwarded me a job application for an organization called the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, which is the nation's oldest, largest, and most diverse civil and human rights coalition. And I thought it was perfect for me because in undergrad, I'd focused primarily on African Americans, and LCCR focused on a wide range of minorities and underrepresented communities, everything from gay and lesbians to women, to people with disabilities and people of color. So I worked there in the field department for several years and just fell in love with this thing we call the civil rights movement. But when I left there, the reason was because I wanted to focus specifically on my generation. I felt that I was in a very unique place of being able to see kind of the direction of this national movement and trying to find a place for young people to fit in now, not just when we were in our 40s and 50s and when we had matured professionally. And so I left there and came to Campus Progress, and it's been a great 2 years there now.
How did you get to Campus Progress? I mean, who hired you, and what was the reason they hired you?
It was a young woman who's actually a very dear friend of mine now named Keisha Center. She'd found my name, I honestly don't know how, when they were hosting a panel on the Hill called How to Get a Job on the Hill. But it was a little bit broader than Hill jobs. It was basically talking to young people about how to get jobs in progressive America, working for something that you care about. I was invited to be a panelist there. I talked about my work at the time at the Leadership Conference, and she recruited me the next day.
Where did you learn to speak?
Where did I learn to speak? I think my parents, in particular my father, who I said was a full-time pastor. He started our church when I was 9 months old, and it just came so natural to him, and I was enthralled when I watched him speak. In any and every setting, whether that means from the pulpit to a large audience, to working one-on-one with young people, to talking and counseling, to at the grocery store. He was just such an eloquent man, and someone, and I say was, he passed away when I was 16 years old. But he inspired me to be able to use the gift of gab. I always used to get in trouble for talking in school. But to be able to use that to help people and to actually change people's circumstances and lives.
So your mom's a minister.
My mother is also a minister. She ended up taking over the church and assuming the position of senior pastor when my father passed away in 2000. But she had always been co-pastor and stepped more prominently into the role of public speaker in 2000, and again has been such an inspiration to me.
Where's the church?
The church is in Temple Hills, Maryland. It's a suburb suburb right outside of D.C.
What denomination?
Non-denominational, although I would say we have kind of Baptist Pentecostal leanings.
How big is the church?
Close to 100 members. It's a pretty small, close-knit community, and I really consider everyone there like family. They pretty much watched me grow up, and I've watched babies being born, and it's a family church, and I love it to death.
Did you ever have to stand up in front of the church and speak?
Did I? I was in front of the church pretty much every Sunday doing anything and everything. I'm also a vocalist, so I was up there singing from the time I was 4. And then when you sing in church, you have to introduce the song, so you have to talk about it. And in church, you don't just say the name of the song, you say what it means and why you chose the song and what you hope people get out of it. And then from there, I did church announcements every week. And from there, I became the youth education ministry director and taught children. And then I did mini sermons to my youth group. So I was always speaking from a young age.
I read one of your blogs, and I wanted to read this back to you just to get your reaction to it. This was, I think it was November 25th, so it was 2008, after the election.
Okay.
You said here, seriously, sitting daily in an office of white, buttoned-up liberal men
Oh, no.
that have PhDs in nuclear proliferation and have been lobbying since 1965. It was so refreshing to sit in a room with people that aren't desperately in need of wrinkle cream, wear jeans, and reference the lyrics to T.I.'s Live Your Life right before explaining a sociological theory of self-interest and self-preservation.
Yes.
You talking about me?
No, not at all. You do
okay.
not need wrinkle cream. And there's nothing wrong with people who do. That was just my humorous way of kind of talking about the differences in our generation within this work for social justice and progressive policy. There's such a wide range. There's a diversity both of opinion and obviously age, but then even inherent in that age difference is a difference of approach. The way we talk about the issues that we care about, the way we see solutions, the way we see things is very cross-cutting and not just being environment, not just being civil rights, not just being reproductive rights, but actually kind of all combining together. And I guess that was my funny way of highlighting that.
Well, I don't want to contrast with me, but I do want to contrast with somebody your own generation.
Okay.
Who was on last week, Matthew Continental, 27. I wanted to run a clip where he said he had been more liberal than conservative. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he went to Columbia, and this is the reason he gave for becoming more conservative.
Okay.
Everyone at Columbia has to take this core curriculum, and part of the core curriculum is a kind of a political philosophy course called Contemporary Civilization. And part of that is you read The Republic, Plato's Republic. I loved that book. And there's a passage in the book where Socrates debates his interlocutor, this guy Thrasymachus, about the nature of slavery. And reading this passage, it occurred to me, when we think of slavery, we think of one person's or one state's dominion over another person or a group of people. But as Socrates points out, there's another version of slavery. It's internal. People can be slaves to their own appetites, for example. You know, you can be a drug addict, you can be addicted to food or other things. That type of slavery we don't talk about. And as I thought about it more, it made me understand probably a distinction between conservatives and liberals. Liberals look at the world and they see, basically they're seeing the world through the eyes of the philosopher Rousseau, who thought we were all born free and great, but society imposed all these things, that it made us slaves. But I think when you look at Socrates or you look at some other philosophers, you realize it's not really the case. Men are actually born, and women are born with a certain set of appetites that they have to overcome. And I think this internal problem is something that conservatives recognize, but liberals do not.
What do you think?
I 100% disagree with him. And I disagree on so many points, I'm trying to figure out where to start. I'll start with the last point, that liberals, or progressives as I say, don't understand the need to kind of, I think he was referencing kind of the model of self-responsibility and this idea of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and kind of dealing with your own internal demons. And then as a result of those things, the subtext is what I have a problem with. The subtext of that philosophy is that therefore, because of people's internal demons and things that they may or may not be predisposed to or issues that they have to deal with, that shouldn't somehow determine to a great deal their lot in life and their social status. I completely disagree with that. But I also don't, my framing for being a progressive has nothing to do with this philosophy over that philosophy with regards to people's amount of responsibility. Instead, it's about, I look at our Constitution. I look at what this nation in particular, I'm talking about the United States, what our nation has promised its citizens. And I simply judge our nation and our government by whether or not they live up to those promises. I think perhaps the way in which we interpret those promises are different. Maybe my definition of justice and equality is very different than his. But I'm not a diehard Democrat, nor will I ever be a diehard Republican. And I don't remember who on Saturday's panel at the State of the Black Union said this, but as a person who comes from an underrepresented community in particular, whether I'm talking about my race or my gender, I think it's very important not to necessarily identify wholeheartedly with one party, but instead to look at which party, which political ideology at this point in time, at this point in history, is advancing the goals that I think my nation needs to advance. For me right now, that's why I'm a progressive.
I think it was Al Sharpton that made that
Okay.
point, and we actually have a clip of that. I want to make sure I know which one it is on the list here. I think we can run this, and he made the point you're making there, and see what if you want to amplify it. Let's watch.
Great.
The reason I'm here is because the agenda for civil and human rights was not just to get blacks in high places. It was to get equality for all of us. Reason I'm here is we are still double unemployed black to white. We are still #1 in the 9 worst health diseases in the country. We are still getting an unequal education 55 years after Brown versus the Board of Education. The achievement gap black to white is the same as it was in 1954. The reason I'm here is we are still 3 times more likely to go to jail for the same crime with the same criminal background. We are still more likely to be turned down for a bank loan. We have the freedom to be president. We have the freedom to be chair of the party. We do not have equality on the ground. We did not go to jail. We did not march. We did not get stabbed and some shot and killed just to get some blacks through. We did that to get all blacks, all whites, all Latinos, all of us on an even playing field. And until we have that even playing field, until a black child and a white child and a Latino child and an Asian child born this afternoon are going to face the same equal protection under the law and the same equal opportunity, they better get used to me, and a lot of other of us are going to be here for a long time.
There you go, brother.
Reaction.
Well, I was waiting. I was glad you played the very end of that clip in particular, because I was waiting for him to say, and I remembered him saying, equal protection and equal opportunity. And I think a lot of times when conservatives hear progressives use the word equality, it perhaps implies that we're saying everyone should be at the same level all the time. Everyone should be rich, or everyone should have a college education. And it's not that. We don't, live in some utopia where we think that everyone has the exact same talent and the exact same skills. But again, it's about equal protection under the law and equal opportunity, so that the children he was talking about being born this afternoon or last Saturday afternoon will, to a certain extent, as far as the government is concerned, as far as systemically in our nation, as far as structures are concerned, face the same obstacles and have the same chances.
This may not be the right question, but as I was watching Al Sharpton, and we've had him on here for years, and I think about what's happening right now with President Obama in the White House, what is it about Al Sharpton that didn't appeal to enough Americans to get elected president, and what is it about Barack Obama that did appeal?
I think, and this is again just my personal opinion and the opinion of the people that I've chatted with about this very thing, I think it has to do with tactic, tone, approach, but not fundamental principle, and I think that's where a lot of people have it wrong. Al Sharpton is actually not that different in philosophy and an agenda than President Obama. I think it's tone. Reverend Sharpton comes from a different era. He was steeped in the rhetoric and the environment and the atmosphere of what we consider now the traditional civil rights movement of the 60s. President Obama was not. And so the way in which he tackles issues of race is a bit different. The way that he talks about issues of inequality is a bit different, perhaps more inclusive in the way that it sounds to the modern ear. Although I can say that I'm sure Reverend Al Sharpton, and he spoke about it there, he said, so that the black child, the white child, his message has always been just as inclusive, just has Reverend Jackson's. But I think President Obama is just a modern incarnation of those two men.
In some of the material I've read, your things that you've said in the past, the war was important to you.
Yes.
The Iraq War.
Yes.
There's some talk, I mean, if you listen to some of the talk shows this week, some of the conservatives are not unhappy with Barack Obama. They think he basically just did the same thing that President Bush would have done. Is he getting out fast enough for you?
Is he? Not for me. That doesn't mean I don't trust his judgment. And I think that's the beauty of having a president that you voted for actually in office, is that you can trust. I trust the people that he has around him. Would I like him to get out faster? I believe even faster than he said now, which is what he committed to on the campaign trail. Of course I would. You know, the less time that my peers will be, you know, giving up their lives, the less time that we'll be expending resources there and not here domestically. But again, I trust his judgment. And I trust that when he's come to this decision, it's not because he has reneged on a promise per se, but that he has evaluated. What he said on the campaign trail is that his goal was to get us out in X amount of months, but he would reevaluate once elected. So again, I trust his judgment, and I'm waiting to see what happens.
So what do you think about him sending another 17,000 troops to Afghanistan?
I'm not happy about it. But again, based on what he said, based on his reasoning for sending that many troops there, I'm hoping that that is a part of a strategic plan. I think one of the things that we've learned from the past administration is that as Americans, we are willing to a certain extent give our president the benefit of the doubt if we feel that he or she is being honest, if we feel that there is thought put into the decision, and that there's a plan, that there's a strategy, and a strategy that the American people are aware of and have access to. So that's what I'm hoping with this decision.
Go back to your University of Maryland days. What year did you graduate?
2005.
And you said you majored in African American studies.
Yes.
What do you study when you study African American studies?
You study the classic writers, you study James Baldwin, you study, there are two tracks in the African American Studies discipline, at least at the University of Maryland. There's public policy and culture. I, of course, couldn't decide and did a combination of both. But if you study the public policy track, you study in particular the history of political currency that African Americans have had in this country. If you study the cultural track, you study the evolution of culture, judging way back from actually our enslavement from Africa to here, also in the Caribbean. Just like any other major, there are a number of different tracks that you can go down, a number of different areas of focus. For me in particular, it was important to look at the connection between policy and culture. So for my thesis, I focused on Washington, D.C. and the gentrification that happened in the U Street corridor. I looked at the history of the U Street corridor, the legend of how that used to be considered Black Broadway, the artists, the doctors, the innovation that came out of that region, and then I compared that to now. And I looked at the impact of public policy of things like eminent domain and how not only has that impacted the area and the region economically, but also culturally. Where are those cultural hubs that African Americans in the District of Columbia used to have concentrated in that certain area? So that's just an example.
Let me stop you, though. For somebody that's never been to Washington, you're saying the U, as in the letter U.
The letter U Street.
Corridor.
Yes.
And what would that? How would you define that in this town? And I mean, people might remember back to the 1968 riots and the Shaw area and
exactly,
all that.
Shaw and
Explain
Columbia Heights.
what that whole thing is, what that area is.
What it is now or what it used to be?
Well, both. I mean, and what you learned when you did your thesis.
So what I learned in the 40s and the 50s, the U Street area, the corridor, which we're talking about, the area down near 16th Street in Washington, D.C., that area was considered Black Broadway because there was a concentration of African American, both entertainers, but also, and Broadway was perhaps the incorrect term for it because it was more than entertainers. It was Black professionals, Black nurses and doctors and lawyers and business people. It was a concentration of middle-class African Americans also living side by side with low-income African Americans, kind of creating their own community. In the District of Columbia, which at that time, again, while African Americans have traditionally always lived in the region, that was kind of the most popular area. There's Lincoln Theater, which is a legendary theater. There were bookstores. That's where Duke Ellington, came and played. That area has changed dramatically, so that if you go walk down the same 16th Street or walk down U Street now, there is not a concentration of African Americans. There is, a lot of I'd say economic development there that was very intentional to bring money back into the city after, that the Arabs kind of decimated after the 1968 riots. But now there's just a change in culture. And while culture changes naturally, and that can happen anywhere, when gentrification occurs, which is the pushing out of lower income residents in order to be able to bring more income in, it's a very deliberate and strategic process. It happens on a timeline. It happens with someone sitting in a boardroom or people sitting in the boardroom, oftentimes not with the input of the community members, saying what will be built there and where the people will go. And so looking at that, I actually focused on Sister Space, which is a legendary bookstore that was there that was run by 2 African-American women. Their building and their business, their property was taken by eminent domain. That was a bookstore that, I don't know how much money it made, how much revenue it may or may not have brought to the city, but it was something that many African-Americans in the District of Columbia held very dear that was gone. And so I focused on examples like that to show how gentrification as a process, while again it brings revenue to the city, has an impact, has a very obvious and dramatic impact on whatever culture, whether it was a culture that the government knew about or not, it existed and there's an impact there. And that could somehow be ameliorated by working with community members to talk about the development. And that's happening in certain places across the country. Washington, D.C. is not unique, but it's my hometown. So
people should know that if you walked out of the north portico of the White House and kept on walking, you're on 16th Street.
Yep.
That's 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, and you go all the way to you, and there you are in that area. What is your, do you have a heroine, a hero, somebody you look back either in history or in your life today that you would put right up there at the top, somebody you admire?
Let's see. There are a lot of people. Shirley Chisholm is a person that I admire, the African-American woman who ran for president. I find her to be inspiring, not just because she was the first to do something, but because she was able to balance, some say well, some say not so well, but within herself she was able to balance the idea of being a woman and being a woman of color. And I found that I kind of went back and read her story again during this past election when people would often ask me, well, you're a woman, are you voting for Hillary? Well, you're black, are you voting for Obama? And there was this dynamic of, as a person who's a social justice activist or someone who's working for change in the progressive movement, that it's hard to be able to separate your identities as a person. And I felt that in Shirley Chisholm's work, she was able to talk about, neither one is more important to me. I'm a woman, I'm a person of color, and both of those things are impacting why I do the work that I do, and I hold that dear and kind of say the same thing.
And she ran for president in 72.
Yes.
How about somebody else?
Somebody else. This is a tough question because there's so many people. I don't want to say Dr. King, even though, of course, he inspires me. Actually, ironically enough, this is someone I don't know if I would say going back in history because he's very, very current, but someone that I look up to a great deal, and that's Van Jones. I mentioned him earlier.
On the stage?
On the stage.
Last Saturday at the State of the Black Union?
Yes. He's making history now. And,
how?
By talking, and I talked about this a little while ago, by combining this issue of environmentalism and the economy and poverty, but talking about it in a way to a community that perhaps may or may not have in the past been attached or connected to or felt invested in the environmental movement, and that's people of color. And he's doing it in a way that says, you know what, this is our movement. This is about our generation. This is about our future. This is about our communities. And he's really revolutionizing the way we talk about the environment. I think that's really inspiring.
Give us some idea of what you read every day and listen to. What's your first newspaper you pick up?
The Washington Post. And then, of course, New York Times. What do I listen to? Well, that's not all I read. Those are the two main papers.
Go back to those two. Why do you pick up those two every day?
Well, Washington Post because it's my hometown paper, and I feel that it does a great job of covering both national and local news that is relevant to me and my personal community in the metro section. The New York Times, because my personal favorite, aside from the coverage of the actual news, that I do think they actually do a pretty good job of covering international news. I love the op-ed pages. I love being able to hear from, I would call quote unquote regular people who may or may not be journalists, but who have an opinion that I either haven't heard before or are able to articulate it in a different way. And I think the New York Times has amazing op-eds, editorials.
What kind of television do you watch for information? What do you listen to talk radio at all?
Don't listen to talk radio much. I actually just moved into a new apartment and don't have cable, so I don't watch that much TV anymore. I find myself online and on blogs quite a bit. Of course, I read the Huffington Post. I read the Drudge Report. And then I have kind of a weakness for gossip media. I know that's shocking, but I do, just because I find it interesting to see a lot of what I talk about in my day-to-day work, systems of inequality and, the images and representations of women or people of color, the lack of representation in mainstream media of, X, Y, or Z community. I find that reflected in social media. I find that reflected a lot in popular culture, and I love to kind of look and compare, and even in my writing or in things that I talk about with young people every day, being able to draw connections between policy that I work on and things that people may or may not have seen on TV or on the internet.
Do you read on purpose things you don't agree with? Do you find some place where, like the Wall Street Journal editorial page or things like that? Do you ever do that?
I do. Because of where I work, because I work at the Center for American Progress, on a day-to-day basis, I'm inundated with materials, op-eds, reports, things from any number of right-wing or conservative sources, and then of course you wouldn't call it a journalism outlet necessarily right-wing or conservative, but also from the Wall Street Journal. I get those through my inbox every day and don't really have to go out and buy the Wall Street Journal, but I do find it interesting, and I think it's really important and instructive in the work that I do to be able to understand not what the other side is saying just so that I can argue with it, but sometimes even maybe change an opinion or say, you know what, that's not that bad.
Let's go back to your whole program during the election. Mm-hmm. What did you do, and how long did you do it during the last election cycle?
Okay, so at Campus Progress, what we did, we're a nonpartisan organization. We're a 501c3, which means we weren't encouraging people to vote for any particular candidate, but instead we're encouraging young people to focus on the issues when they talked about voting. There were so many other outlets and influences that were telling young people to vote because of, and I talked about this at the State of the Black Union, to vote because of Facebook, or to vote because there's this hot song out, or to vote because the person, again, was an African American or a woman or, from Arizona, whatever the case may have been. We wanted to make sure that we were out there telling young people, no, vote on the issues. We know that that's what you really care about. So let's make sure that the mainstream media hears that from you. So at Campus Progress, we led a campaign called I'm Voting For, where we collected video testimonials of young people saying not who they were voting for, but what. And so we collected videos online on imvotingfor.org, where young people were not only saying the issue, but connecting it with a personal story or experience or narrative in their life to say that politics is very personal and this election is very personal. In addition to collecting those testimonials, we went all around the country to campuses in not just battleground states, but I think we hit about 30 to 35 states, engaging people in conversations about the issues so that they could be informed voters, making sure that people had resources, access to resources to find out the information that would help them determine who they were going to vote for.
What's the number one issue that young people wanted to talk to you about?
From our experience, it was the environment. Although halfway during the campaign, I would say that switched a little bit to the economy. I think it's really interesting to note that while young people are a unique demographic, obviously because of our age and because of the different influences and perspectives that we have, we are still Americans. And so when the economy hit everyone hard, it hit young people hard too. So that when the Iraq War was at the top of the news pages, that's what we cared about too. Oftentimes people look at young people and say, oh, they're this different voting bloc who may or may not vote, and we're not really sure what they care about. The concerns for large overarching issue areas are pretty much the same as with the rest of the nation. The issue is, again, in how we talk about the issues, perhaps what we see as the solutions to the issues. But the concerns are oftentimes pretty similar.
Why did you have to be nonpartisan?
That's the nature of Center for American Progress. Center for American Progress is a nonpartisan organization. And we think it's important, and it helps us talk a little bit more about progressive values rather than, again, party or candidate.
But it's like the Heritage Foundation. There's nobody in town that doesn't think the Heritage Foundation is conservative.
Right.
Is there anybody in town that thinks that the Center for American Progress is anything but a liberal institution, often cited during the George Bush years as being government in exile?
Right. I don't know if there's anyone who thinks we aren't, but I can say that we do make a concerted effort. If you look down, kind of go on our website at americanprogress.org and even at Campus Progress and see the list of events that we have, who our co-sponsors are, who we work with, we're really deliberate about making sure that when we present our side, we also present the other side, that we make sure that in having conversations and debate and dialogue, that we work with conservatives very regularly.
Anybody ever say to you that the reason that everybody in these think tanks want to be nonpartisan is because of the tax law?
I've heard that said, but I work with the people on a day-to-day basis, and I know that's not the case.
You don't think it is?
No, I don't think it is. people who work at the Center for American Progress could easily work, at the DCCC. They could easily work for the administration. They could easily work, and some left and did. I think people that remain and people that stay there have a commitment to progressive ideals and have a commitment to debate and logic and thought that may or may not fall squarely into a particular party.
So we've covered the State of the Black Union with Travis Smiley for 10 years. When you were growing up, did you ever watch it?
I did. I don't think I started watching it till about 3 years ago. I read the coverage of it a lot, but I didn't start watching it until about 3 years ago. I actually watched Travis Smiley on other networks and little interviews that he would do here and there. I used to listen to him on the radio. I read his books, but I didn't watch the State of the Black Union obviously for the full 10 years.
So what role does it play? And you participated for the first time this year, but what role do you think it plays in the nation, also in the black community?
Two answers. I think one, in the black community, it's a really valuable opportunity to, and this is something that Travis says all the time, to be able to see some of the opinion leaders, the thought leaders, the professors, the political activists, the teachers, be able to see these people come together and have conversation and dialogue. I think, honestly, the imagery and the visibility of it is so important. I don't want to overlook that. The substance is, and we can get to that later, but I think it's so rare that we see Reverend Al Sharpton or Reverend Jesse Jackson on television, on the news, talking for more than 30 seconds about some protest or talking about something that's hot topic in the news. They have so much more to say. There are so many people of color who have a lot to say and a lot to contribute, great ideas, great perspective, great commentary that we so rarely see. So number one, I think just there's a value in bringing that together.
This is one of the first years there was a Republican on the stage.
Yes, Michael Steele.
Michael Steele sat right next to you.
Yes, sat right next to me.
All right. I'm actually looking at the political newspaper, which people read in this town and other places. He's the lead story today. It's called Steele Trap, ? And the first paragraph by Mike Allen and Andy Barr says, a month after Michael Steele became the first African-American chairman of the Republican National Committee, key party leaders are worried that the GOP has made a costly mistake, one that will make it even harder for them to take back power from the dominant Democratic Party.
Ooh.
Surprised to hear that?
No, not too surprised. I was actually kind of following up and reading a lot about what's been going on now between Rush Limbaugh and Michael Steele this past weekend. Hearing Michael Steele on Saturday at the State of the Black Union, sitting next to him and talking to him, I was impressed. I'll say it cautiously. I was impressed by his desire, or by his expressed desire, to change the Republican Party, to kind of, have an emphasis on diversity, have an emphasis on dialogue, have an emphasis on civility, frankly. And what disappointed me immediately following that was his very swift apology to Rush Limbaugh. I was confused. I was upset about it because it said to me, now, wait a minute, one of two things is the case here. Either, you are some sort of shadow leader and that Rush Limbaugh really is still the most important opinion leader of your party, or that you don't really mean the things you're saying, that you do stand behind some of the divisive rhetoric that the Republican Party has often had. And so hearing now that the party is saying perhaps he wasn't the best choice, I don't know what to think. I don't know if that suggests that perhaps he is being genuine and is really trying to make change and that people are always resistant to change. Or is it that they just don't think he's effective? I'm not sure.
Well, here he is from the State of the Black Union last Saturday.
Okay.
Do you feel a bit awkward as a black man having to challenge the first black man in the White House?
I don't look at it that way. I don't look at it as challenging Barack Obama. When Barack first came to Washington in 2005, I'd been lieutenant governor of my state of Maryland for 2 years, the only African-American elected statewide in the country until Barack, at that level, had come to the Senate. So my first outreach was to him, to welcome him and congratulate him, to find out how we could work together, even though I was a state official, he was federal. I was a Republican, he was a Democrat, to see what synergies that we could work on together, because we had one thing in common. We were both black men in very influential and important positions. So I thought, and I still think, that that is the key opportunity. So I don't look at this, while I may disagree with elements of the Obama stimulus plan, I may disagree with certain other policies, I still see this as a chance to continue that outreach, if you will, to the administration to work together on those things that we have in common.
What did he say to you sitting next to him?
that I was the future, that he was very impressed with me, that it's inspiring to see young people who care about the issues. Same thing everyone else in the panel said.
Did you believe them all?
Yeah, I did. I mean, I think they were so warm and so welcoming and so supportive, both on the stage and off. The entire weekend, I spent time with every single person on that panel who said, continue to do what you do. You're the next generation. I think it was really vital and important for someone, my age to be on the panel, and he agreed.
By the way, in this article, the second paragraph of this article, and people will be able to see it on the screen because there are quote marks around some of it. It says, Mike Allen and Andy Barr write, steadily becoming a dependable punchline, Steele has brushed back Rush Limbaugh, threatened moderate Republican senators, offered the, quote, friggin' awesome Louisiana Governor Bobby Jindal some slum love, called civil unions crazy, and promised more outreach to, quote, urban, suburban hip-hop settings via a, quote, off-the-hook, unquote, public relations campaign. He even threw a shout out to, quote, one-armed midgets, unquote.
Yes. We actually, a dear friend of mine wrote a piece about Steele's commitment to outreaching to urban youth, whatever that means. I think that has actually been my biggest pet peeve with him and bone to pick, is the language he's using and the I guess you would call it a tactic. I'm not even sure what it is that he's actually doing to outreach to a more diverse audience, but trying to figure out how to talk about that, he's not doing that good of a job. I think not only is he tokenizing young people, number one, if he's talking about young people, he's tokenizing young people, then he's tokenizing young people of color, and then number three, he's tokenizing young people of color who identify with hip-hop culture. Hip-hop culture is not slang. It's not just a couple words. And you can't change the curtains on something if the house is still dirty. Using the language that he's using and using slang and talking in MTV terms is not going to make the Republican Party more appealing to young Democrats. It's not going to make conservative ideals more appealing to young progressives. You need to talk about issues and you need to talk about substance.
You wrote in your blog some things about an issue that he kind of tangentially referred to here, and I'll read it. This is from November the 8th. Okay. Who reads your blog, by the way?
I don't know, actually. It's my small little private blog until now. Most people didn't even know about it.
Oh, maybe we ought to tell them how to get there. It was ironic and problematic that African Americans in California voted largely in favor of Proposition 8. Mm-hmm. But much of the analysis surrounding the demographic breakdown of the loss has been completely superficial, divisive, and counterproductive. As a whole, we live in a homophobic society, period. What is the whole thing about African Americans in Proposition 8 that the African Americans voted for it? What does that mean out in California? What was Proposition 8?
Proposition 8 was the ban on gay marriage, the ban on, and some people choose to say same-sex marriage. And it was a vote that I feel tore a lot of progressives apart in California. The day after the election, when a lot of progressives were excited about a new administration, a lot of my friends were in tears, saying that, we voted for progress on this issue. We voted for progress in so many different ways. We elected the first African-American president, and at the same time are denying rights to people in our country, are denying, marriage rights to citizens. And in particular, there was a lot of blame placed. That blog post, actually, and that was written on our organization's blog on campusprogress.org. There was a lot of blame placed, particularly to African Americans. And I went on to write about, you can't point fingers. People want to compare the struggle now that gays and lesbians are fighting for equality to the civil rights movement. And while there are clearly parallels, there are clearly fundamental parallels and similar principles, or I would even go so far as to say the same principles at stake that we're talking about, you have to be careful about language. We have to be careful about talking about a new movement in the exact same terms and in the exact same language and using the rhetoric of a movement that an entire group of people, African Americans, hold very dear and hold very personal.
Explain, and tell me where I'm wrong here, but the perception is that African Americans are, how do I phrase this, are somewhat homophobic.
That is the perception.
Is it accurate? And is there an age difference there?
Yeah, it's hard. I can't answer that question in terms, because again, African Americans, and one thing that Michael Steele did say pretty eloquently is that we're not a monolithic group, either politically, ideology. there is a perception in commercialized African American culture, which for all intents and purposes now is hip hop culture. Hip hop culture is, commercialized hip hop culture is very homophobic. Gay slurs are used all the time. There is a legacy of being afraid of gays and lesbians and of homosexuality and not talking about those issues. Then when you talk about, and I use this phrase in quotes because I come from it, the African American church, there's a legacy there of not talking about issues of sexuality at all, straight or gay. And then when you do, being very fundamentalist in nature. And so again, kind of relying, and this has been a very personal issue for me just because as I've gotten older, I hold my faith very, very dear. I'm very, very active in my church, but I've gotten much more liberal and much more progressive in my views around sexuality and around equality. And I think that's the most important issue. For me, this isn't a discussion about sexuality. This isn't a discussion about right or wrong. This is ultimately a discussion about rights and about fairness and about equality in our country. And that's how I encourage the African Americans that I talk to look at this. I don't care whether you think it's good or bad or a sin or strange or weird to be gay. I'd like you to be more open-minded than that. I think we need you to be more open-minded than that. But right now, that particular vote, it was about equality. It was about rights that you hold dear, that generations ago, you as an African American were not allowed to marry a person of another race. This is the same issue. But I think what was wrong with the campaign was how that issue was framed and how we talked about it. African Americans largely were either not talked to at all, or if so, no one knew how to approach this issue from the perspective, again, of rights and equality without saying this is the same thing as the civil rights movement.
You talked earlier about losing your father, 9 years ago?
9 years ago.
To cancer?
No, to a heart attack.
To a heart attack. Mm-hmm. How old was he?
He was 42.
42?
42, and I was 16.
What I want to ask you about is your mother, pastor.
Yes, Pastor Williams.
Pastor Williams. What's the difference in thinking about the Barack Obama election between her and you? In other words, is there a different way of looking at this whole business?
Well, there isn't now. There isn't now because I used to come home every day and talk her head off about it.
But was there a difference?
No, I think my mother's a very, I consider her to also be very progressive. Even though perhaps she's conservative on some social issues, I consider her to be very politically progressive. And so she was excited about Barack Obama. I think what she wanted to make sure as a pastor, again, her role was not ever under any circumstances to talk about politics from the pulpit. Her perspective on those issues is, I want to make sure that we have informed voters. Because she remembered in 2004 when a lot of people of faith were, my phrase is, hoodwinked and bamboozled to believe that if you were a person of faith, you had to vote for George Bush. That's the only way. You vote on 3 issues. You vote on gays and guns and God, and that's it, and that's what you do. And so her concern with this election was to say, I don't care if it's Barack Obama. I don't care if it's Hillary Clinton. I don't care if it's John McCain. I want to make sure that me and my parishioners are educated voters. And so she talked a lot about, making sure that people had access to resources, making sure that they knew what websites to go to, which is a big deal for her because she doesn't use the internet that much. But the perspective was just that I was a little bit quicker to say, this is it, this feels right. And she said, I want to hold back, and I want to learn. I want to learn a lot about this process.
Are there other children in the family?
Yes, my younger sister who is 18 and is a freshman now at University of Maryland.
What'd she think of what you're doing?
She loves it. She's not as politically focused as I am. She loves it. She's smart. She's savvy. She understands what's happening, but it's not how she chooses to spend her fun time. She's much more into, she's a musician. She's a vocalist. She plays basketball. She's kind of the social butterfly on campus. And so she loves the fact that I do this work, but I wouldn't call her a student activist.
How much of American history are you interested in? And how much have you studied versus African American history?
Well, I don't see the two as being very different. I see African American history as being a segment of American history. So if by that question you mean how much have I, broadened what I studied?
Well, actually, I'll tell you where I'm coming from that question. I mean, I've been to lots and lots of museums in this country, and often you don't see African Americans.
Right, absolutely.
And I wondered if this president will change their interest in history, or if they're interested in other ways.
Change whose interest in history? I'm sorry.
African Americans. In other words, in the old white guy history of years ago is what I'm getting at.
Yeah. I hope that's the case. You know, there is this perception that African Americans don't know much about general American history, but you hit the nail on the head. That's because general American history, as it's told in textbooks and through the media, does not incorporate African Americans, which is so strange and so bizarre. And so perhaps Barack Obama, as now being a part of, you know, this broader picture that we're all calling our history now, ours, not just African Americans, but as a nation, hopefully that will. But you know, your question was, will it make African Americans more interested in history? I hope so, but more importantly, I hope it will make Americans, all Americans, more interested in a full and complete American history.
Back to the Tavis Smiley Day.
Yes.
Here's a name that has been there every year, Cornell
West.
Let's watch.
Okay.
And the whole world is watching to see the depths of our commitment to accountability and truth and justice. And do we have what it takes? Depends on how much courage we have, how much compassion we have, what kind of commitment we have. You see, it might be the case that we don't have what it takes. I don't believe that, but we don't have what it takes. But we come from a tradition that says if we're going to dance with folk, then we ought to do it with some swing. Oh, yes. And if you look closely at what's in the swing, it is courage, delicacy, sophistication, some funk too, because you got to tell the truth. But most importantly, as Curtis Mayfield put it, and he came out with his album 10 years ago, the same time we started calling for what? A new world order. That's what we need now, a new world order with swing, commitment to courage and deep compassion, but most importantly, a willingness to be truthful. And truth always cuts a number of different ways. That's where the wounds come from.
Break all this down for us. What do you think of Cornell West?
I love that man. I mean, of course, I read him. I was introduced to him with Race Matters. I believe that was his first book, or at least the first one that came kind of on the national scene into national acclaim, both within academia and outside. So I read him in school, kind of was obsessed with his writing and the way in which he talked about race and justice and politics through a lens of a word that most people in politics don't ever talk about, which is love. It's something that's so refreshing about the way he talks about issues. He talks about them at a very human level. He talks about people's fundamental humanity and as race being a way to color that humanity and a lens through which we look at other people's humanity. And so meeting him for the first time in this way, I've met him, I've run up to him and asked him to sign things before at speeches, but actually getting a chance to have conversations with him, he's the same as what you just saw in that clip.
So what's he mean by swing? You gotta have some swing.
Yeah, I mean, I think he means a little bit of edge, a little bit of, you gotta move with what you're doing. It's not necessarily just very straight and by the books and cut edge. And whether he's talking about, culturally, or I think in this instance he was actually talking about the way in which we approach our nation, the way in which we approach politics, the way in which we approach policy solutions. If he wasn't talking about that, that's how I interpreted it. To mean that we do it creatively. We do it in a way the same way in which he does his work, which is talking again about politics, but then bringing it into religion and bringing in culture and music and drama, kind of making sure that we're complete and full people.
What's he mean by funk?
What does he mean by? I don't know what he meant by funk. I think again, it's part of that pop, that snap. When I think of funk, I actually do think of my mother. I think of when she listens to funk music, which she doesn't do often as a pastor, but occasionally when she pops in old.
How do you define funk music?
I don't know how to define funk. Maybe I should call my mom and ask.
Do you know when you hear it?
Yeah, I know when I hear it. And I know when she listens to George Clinton, kind of the way she moves her head a little bit and the way she pops her finger, that's funk.
Pastors do that?
Pastors still do that. Cool pastors do.
Cool pastors. All right, go to Eric Holder.
Yes.
A nation of cowards when it comes to the discussion of race. Did you agree with him when he said that? And if you did, what did he mean to you?
I 100% agree with him, and I was so excited that he said it because, again, it's not often that we hear public officials on a national stage talk about the things that America has not done well with regards to race. And I took it as meaning, yes, nationally, but specifically in his area, which is, justice and the justice system, criminal justice in particular. I think we have not approached justice in the same way and with the same tenacity, perhaps, as we approached education. perhaps in the same way as which we approach initially healthcare. Now, whether the outcomes of any of those areas are any better than criminal justice, one would argue no, not really. There's still great disparities in the healthcare system and the education system, just as much as there are in the justice system. But I think him saying that says that we need to refocus our attention, that in the way our nation has always attacked problems, the way in which, frankly, we go to other countries and attack problems. Race has been kind of the blemish. And when I say race, I don't mean the existence of race, but the way in which the United States deals with issues of race has been a blemish on our history and our legacy, and we need to attack it with the same tenacity.
All right, give us some concrete example of what has to be changed, in your opinion, to right this wrong.
An example, there are probably many, but an example would be the disparity of prosecution between crack and cocaine.
Cocaine crack and cocaine powder?
Yes, I'm sorry.
All right, what's the difference? What is that issue that keeps bringing? I'll bet they've talked about it for 10 years at the State of the Black Union.
Right, and I don't want to speak on something that I'm not 100% clear on, but generally speaking, there's a difference in the extent to which powder cocaine is prosecuted to a much lighter extent than crack cocaine. Crack hard rock cocaine. Hard rock cocaine is much more prevalent in communities of color, in particular African American communities.
And you get a higher sentence.
And you get a higher sentencing. And we're fundamentally talking about the same drug. Two different forms, consumed by two different groups of people. Sentencing is much higher for communities of color. So that's a small example, but it's one that says there are just some clear fundamental disparities here that we need to address and understand why.
Do you think this president will do anything about that issue, which comes up all the time?
Right. I don't know. I have not yet seen what his agenda is in terms of specifically for criminal justice. I know he talks about equality, but I think there's something that's important that I don't think was emphasized enough at the State of the Black Union this year, and maybe it hasn't in years past either, is that the president is one person. And this is what we talk all the time about with our students at Campus Progress. We're happy that we have a progressive administration right now. We're happy that we have a progressive president, but that is one part of a very, very big puzzle.
Erica Williams, you will be where in 10 years, in your opinion? If say that you're a success in your own eyes, where would you be in 10 years?
I don't know. I know that I'll be happy. I know that I'll still be speaking out on behalf of people who may or may not often speak for themselves. I know that I'll have some sort of large platform, whether it's an organization, whether it's a TV show, maybe I'll be sitting in your chair right there, but someplace to talk about issues that matter to people, and perhaps issues that aren't often brought up in the forefront of mainstream media.
You can take this right now if you want.
Let's switch sides.
Thank you. We're out of time. I appreciate it. Right?
Thank you.
For a DVD copy of this program, call 1-877-662-7726. For free transcripts or to give us your comments about this program, visit us at qna.org. Q&A programs are also available as C-SPAN podcasts.